Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more trustees and we'll begin. Sweet. There we are. Oh, and Tim is here. And Shane will be right here. He just texted me.
Sweet. Is Clayton coming?
Clayton should be here as well.
Okay. Awesome.
Let me know when he pops up in case I miss it.
Okay.
Just get some nervous.
I know the computer stuff is 50.
Hey, we're live streaming, so that was good.
Awesome. There's Jim.
Yes. That's pretty good because a lot of my stuff is on here.
Yeah.
Hi. My apologies.
It's okay, I've been running the show, so we're just a couple minutes. And we were really spaced out.
Hey, Jeff. Hey, Shane, how are you?
Okay.
Good.
Kelly. Okay. Kelly, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yeah.
Just checking. I don't have a microphone near me, so I was just
Oh,
curious.
yeah.
Oh yeah. Sounds good.
Awesome. You want me to kick off the meeting?
Sure.
Are you okay?
I got it as well if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. You start it and I'll.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a work session for the Silverton Board of Trustees. The date is February 6th, 2023, and the time is 5:05 p.m. And I call this work session to order. I guess we could do a quick trustee roll call, but I don't. Sure.
So trustee Cranker,
Here.
trustee Harper. We'll come back here. Trustee Bierma,
Here.
trustee Barney, or.
Yep. Here.
Apologies. Trustee Harper. And trustee Davis
Here.
and Mayor Furman. Sorry, that was way out of order. And Richard is absent. And Mayor Furman.
Here. This will be on YouTube.
Yes, it is on YouTube.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure Tyler's able to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all for joining us tonight. The staff has prepared a little presentation for you all that I'll pull up on the screen here. And we can walk through this work session on wetlands and wetland. Have a couple of guest speakers. I'm going to share my screen. And hey, can you all see that screen? Yep. Okay, great. So I'll just start here. So tonight let me just go to this. All right. We're going to be discussing jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional, and then some policy concepts, if that's the direction that we head. So I've invited several guests tonight to help with our discussion, and we're really grateful for their time and commitment to helping us. And so if we don't know the answer tonight, we'll make a note and get back to you. There's a lot to cover, so we created a slide deck to help us along. The goal of this work session is to come out of the meeting with a better understanding of what jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional wetland means and how it changes. And we also would like to explore some policy options with the trustees, if that's the route this discussion goes. So currently the town refers to the Army Corps for all wetland delineations. But as we will learn tonight, those delineations are kind of always in flux. So to better understand how wetlands are delineated and what the current practice is to determine a wetland, we have two experts here to guide us through this tonight. So I was thinking we could start with an introduction from Tim Funk, who's a local CDOT wetland specialist and who we've been working with to potentially restore the dead fen at the end of town. And then we'll move and talk to our other expert, which is Tucker Fader. He's a local Army Corps senior project manager, and he's prepared to speak on delineations. Any questions before we get started? Mike?
I have one quick one.
Yeah.
Ahead of this meeting, Gloria, can you clarify for everyone who's in the meeting and also maybe watching on YouTube what our it's a work session, and so we won't be making any decisions tonight. And is there anything that you need us to do in terms of direction?
Sure. So we won't be making decisions tonight, and I would encourage us not to talk about specific projects, especially ones that are currently under public hearing. So if we could keep it as general and broad as possible. And then what we're looking for is just giving you all understanding, first of all, and then if we do come out with like, do we want to regulate non-jurisdictional wetlands, kind of giving us a temperature read on some of the policy options that we have. And I want to say that staff, we're not experts on these policy options as of right now, but we're here to get some questions, to run them by you, to see, kind of gauge where you all would like to go if we do go into a wetlands policy. Does that sound good?
Yeah, thank you, Gloria.
Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. Hey everybody, Tim Funk with CDOT. I guess why I got invited to this panel is I'm currently working with John Seitz on the potential mitigation site, where both CDOT and the town potentially need some wetland mitigation. Just some overall background on myself. I've been in my current position as the wetland specialist at CDOT for about 4.5 years. Before that, I worked for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe as a water quality specialist. And before that, I worked as a wetlands consultant for about 15 years. In my current role, I do most of CDOT's wetland delineations across Southwest Colorado, and then obtain most of the jurisdictional determinations. If something's jurisdictional or not jurisdictional, typically from Tucker, who's also on the call, and then obtain permit coverage also from Tucker, who's on the call. Another thing that's kind of unique to CDOT, which might be of interest to you guys, is we do have to, under our FHWA mandate, anytime we do anything with federal funding, we have to mitigate for any impacts to non-jurisdictional wetlands. So we do have kind of an internal CDOT policy as to how we deal with non-jurisdictional wetlands to prevent no net loss of those. And then also some of the other counties I work in and towns in Southwest Colorado, San Miguel County specifically, they have their own wetland guidelines that protect wetlands that are not necessarily jurisdictional under Section 404. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Tucker.
Right on. Thanks, Tim. I'm Tucker Fader. I'm a project manager here in the Durango Army Corps of Engineers office. I've been with the Army Corps of Engineers as a regulator for a little over 3.5 years. I spent the first 3 years or so out of our Grand Junction office. Just moved down here to the Durango area 2 months ago, although I'd been working for the Durango office since middle of last year, but finally was able to make the move down here. So finally sitting in the Durango office after 3.5 years of trying to get down here. Prior to that, I was a park ranger and natural resource specialist with the Corps of Engineers, bounced around Idaho, New Mexico, and Eastern Colorado before finally taking a job in regulatory. My role in regulatory is to screen projects against Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which regulates the discharge of dredged and or fill material into waters of the United States. Waters of the U.S. can range from streams, rivers, wetlands, ponds, lakes, some springs, things like that. And so if a project proposes a discharge of fill, it likely needs a permit, and that permit would come through our office. There's some instances where a permit may not be required, as Tim kind of alluded to, where an aquatic resource may be determined to be non-jurisdictional, and we can get into that a little more later. But as far as projects go in Southern Colorado, it's me and Carrie Ann Zimmel, who are handling all those projects in San Juan County, La Plata, Archuleta, Montezuma, Dolores, all the southwestern counties. So if you got a project in those areas, either myself or Carrie Ann will be your point of contact.
Thank you, Tucker. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional and the difference of those and why there's that delineation.
Yeah, so that stems on our regulations and our current whatever our current implementation of waters of the United States currently are, and that's varied over the last couple of years. We're currently under what we call pre-2015 rulings, which are our jurisdictional determinations are based on court cases, namely one in the 80s called the Rapanos decision. And that's kind of our main kind of governing body, or not governing body, but governing rule over how we're determining jurisdiction. And so to have, jurisdiction as far as like an isolated wetland, for example, or an adjacent wetland, a wetland needs to have some sort of significant nexus to a traditionally navigable water, and it needs to be more than speculative. So, in most often cases, we're looking for basically a surface connection to a relatively permanent water that conveys flows to a traditionally navigable water. The only traditionally navigable waters that we have in Colorado are, navigable and fact waters. We call them Section 10 waters as well, are the Colorado River and Navajo Reservoir. And so if a water eventually ends up in one of those bodies of water, like the Colorado River way downstream, it's jurisdictional, but it needs to be more than speculative. And so in most often cases, in kind of layman's terms, or if you were to walk out onto your property and try and determine that, you'd likely be looking for a surface connection to one of those waters. And so, for example, in like the Silverton area, if you had a wetland that was, kind of isolated and didn't have any outflow into Mineral Creek or the Animas River or Cement Creek or anything like that, that water would be considered isolated, and therefore non-jurisdictional, wouldn't be subject to our regulation. And that determination can only be made by the Corps through an approved jurisdictional determination. So the applicant, the builder, property owner would need to request that from the Corps, and they can provide their own wetland delineation, if they possess those skills, or if they have hired a private consultant to do that for them, or the Corps can perform a wetland delineation. And in doing that delineation, we would then look for some sort of connection to another relatively permanent water. And if it doesn't possess that characteristic, it's likely non-jurisdictional. And that would be kind of the end of the road for the Corps as far as that particular review area goes. And we would issue a letter that says we don't have jurisdiction over this particular resource currently. Now, I caveat that because our rules are changing again here in March. I think March 20th. We'll go to a new rule. We're not expecting major changes. So a lot of the wetlands that we've considered isolated in the past and therefore non-jurisdictional are likely going to remain that way. The new rule is supposed to just be a little bit more understandable to the public.
Can you also clarify that if a wetland, if you have a delineation of a wetland, that is good for up to 5 years, even though sometimes it changes, like the rules will change?
Yeah, so in the past, approved jurisdictional determinations and delineations have been good for 5 years. That's so, things, conditions change on the ground, rules change, things like that. So that's an attempt to allow the requester to, to have some sort of certainty that their determination is valid. So that if they've started work in a non-jurisdictional wetland, that it's not going to suddenly be jurisdictional and the Corps is going to be, breathing down their throat. And so in the past, when we've changed rules, a lot of those jurisdictional determinations have been, even though we've changed rules, they've still been a legal determination. The one exception is when we were under Navigable Water Protection Rule, also known as the Trump Rule. Those jurisdictional determinations have been thrown out or are no longer valid. They would need to come in for another jurisdictional determination. And that's because the rule itself was struck down. It wasn't, we're not, like what we're doing this year is revising the rule. They're putting out a new rule. They're not striking down the previous or our current regulations. However, Navigable Water Protection Rule was struck down, and therefore we're not really honoring those determinations anymore. So a requester would need to provide a new request, and we would make a new determination based on our current rules.
Thank you, Tucker. And I'm just going to ask one more question, and then I'll give it to the trustees. Is it
Okay.
If Tim Funk, if you could explain how CDOT manages non-jurisdictional?
Yeah, sure. So first, yeah, we confirm absolutely that they are non-jurisdictional. As Tucker said, only the Corps can make that determination. You could get an opinion from a consultant, but it's at the end of the day, it's only the Corps' opinion on that's valid. And then secondly, we confirm that jurisdictional determination was made in a period of which the rules match what they are now, right? As Tucker said, there is a possibility that any jurisdictional determinations might have been made during that Navigable Waters Protection Rule era, and those would no longer be valid. But yeah, usually they fall, our non-jurisdictional wetlands in Southwest Colorado are usually due to one of two things. It's either irrigation induced, and that's not going to be very common in the Silverton area, right? Because you guys don't do a lot of irrigation or agriculture, or they're going to be isolated or man-made, right? So I would guess and again, I'm just speaking in generalities, not about any specific site, but I could foresee in the Silverton area, where you have old mining borrow pits and things like that, where wetlands could form that would be isolated. That would be the non-jurisdictional water. So there's an executive order. It's called Executive Order 11990. It was issued during the first Bush administration. And it basically calls for across the board no net loss of waters for federal projects. And so much of what CDOT does, we never know when or if we're going to get federal dollars on a project, and that would be the same for projects that pass through CDOT to the town. Those would potentially be federalized. So in those scenarios, FHWA requires no net loss of wetlands, regardless of jurisdictional status. So we usually, will indicate in our plans which wetlands are jurisdictional, which ones are not. If we're impacting jurisdictional wetlands, then we have to get a permit through Tucker's office and mitigate for them. If they're not jurisdictional, we don't require that permit, but we typically still do replace them at a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's what satisfies federal highways. The exceptions to that would be if it's a really, really tiny amount, or if we were to do some sort of internal functional assessment where, and again, this usually would also correspond with a really small amount, but a functional assessment that would indicate that whatever the impact was would not quantifiably reduce the function of the wetlands. And FHWA has agreed in the past to allow that to be a way to not replace them. And by functional assessment, usually what we're looking at is, all wetlands serve numerous ecological functions, from flood storage to pollutant uptake, wildlife, and probably many more that I can't think of off the top of my head. But there are methodologies out there where you can try to quantify the functions of a wetland, and then you can kind of look at it in a before and after state and quantify if what we're doing to it actually does reduce the function of that wetland. But a lot of times that process is harder than just replacing it, 1-to-1. If we're putting a little bit of fill in one spot here, we excavate out a little bit. And a lot of times on these non-jurisdictional wetlands, how we'll deal with it is to kind of change the shape of it potentially. Or if we're, filling one corner here, we'll add another corner somewhere else. The tricky thing with doing that in your guys' area is, the main success criteria for wetland to demonstrate that we've restored wetlands is vegetation. And obviously with the super short growing season in Silverton, it can take many years to determine if something's going to work or not work, which is actually why CDOT's in the situation where we are right now, where we're looking for some potential wetland mitigation to do in the Silverton areas, because we had a site. We impacted jurisdictional wetlands along Mineral Creek and did through the Corps, some jurisdictional wetland mitigation, and it just didn't take, and it took several years for us to kind of realize, well, it's not going to take. It's not just the slow growing season. It's just the site was it was really just too well drained. It didn't have, like Tucker said, what makes a wetland is the vegetation, the soils, if it has hydric soils, and hydrology. And we weren't able to get wetland vegetation to grow back there, likely because the soils were just not right. They were really sandy, gravelly, and the water just passed through too quick. So that's another consideration when restoring wetlands. I know that was a lot of info. Did that answer the question you were asking?
That did, and I'd open it up for the trustees for any questions.
Okay.
Or answers.
Yeah, I guess wetland mitigation, what does that mean?
Well, I guess it could mean one of two things. So I'll let maybe Tucker speak to what it means for jurisdictional standpoint. Really, I think, what mitigating wetland impacts, you always want to, and one of the things we're required to do on even the non-jurisdictional ones is, demonstrate that we're avoiding wetland impacts to the maximum extent practicable, minimizing those impacts when they do happen, right? So things you could do to, an example of a minimization measure would be, if we have to excavate into a wetland, we would segregate the wetland topsoil and put it back on top at the end instead of just different topsoil. Both of them could result in a temporary impact, but one of them is going to bounce back a lot quicker than the other. Or use something like construction mats to operate equipment if you're in a really soggy wetland area to keep you from doing more impact than you absolutely have to. And then the last part of it, which is usually what people refer to as mitigation, is compensatory mitigation, right? And then that's where, for these non-jurisdictional ones, we go with that no net loss approach, which is we try to restore or create as much wetland as we impact on a acre to acre ratio. Now, if it's a jurisdictional wetland, you may need to go above and beyond that, and I'll probably should turn it over to Tucker for that answer.
Well, no, I'm actually going to stop you just because that's kind of even more like, so how do you do that? How do you get back to your one-to-one? Like you're gonna take some wetlands, you're gonna make some wetlands somewhere else. Like, do you expand that wetland you're impacting? Do you go to a whole different site? How does that all?
Yeah, either, right? Ideally, we typically try to replace the wetlands as close to and have them be as close of a match to what we're impacting as possible. So ideally, if we were, like I said, if we were filling in a small portion of a wetland, that same wetland, we would try to increase the size of it elsewhere, typically by excavating down the adjacent uplands to where we're matching the same distance from the ground surface to the water table, right? Typically wetlands have got the water table within a foot to 18 inches of the surface during the growing season. And a lot of times what we'll do is we'll install some kind of monitoring well, just to look at it, just to confirm that that's the distance from the ground surface. And then we know that's the elevation we got to hit with the restoration or the mitigated wetlands, right? So you excavate out an area. But then, sometimes there's site constraints and you can't do it there, right? And that's why we're looking at, right now we're looking with that property, that the same one that John's involved with on the Merrill's property, to do an offsite, because they appear to have what looks like wetlands that probably previously existed, where we could try to create them again or restore them again. So yeah, either or. Usually we try to do it, like I said, in the same general area. One challenge that CDOT has when trying to do wetland mitigation in the Silverton area is a lot of our region is serviced by the Animas River Wetlands Mitigation Bank, which is in Durango, or just north of Durango. However, when that bank was set up, because wetlands down at that elevation are quite a bit different functionally than wetlands at higher elevations, I don't believe they're allowed to sell wetland credits without special permission above 8,500 feet in elevation. So that kind of basically rules out all of Silverton for use, even though it's in the same watershed, use of that. So a lot of times we do the easiest way to do wetland mitigation is for us to just cut a check to that bank if we're in that service area, but in Silverton, we're not.
That kind of leads to my question that I had, and there may be a slide further down. I see we're on 3 of 14, so I can hold it under the topic of compensatory mitigation, and you started to kind of talk about it there, but in looking at Silverton, if we started to get into that into that need more and more, what have you learned about the property in Silverton, or the terrain, or just the geography of Silverton, in terms of like how much is there even available? If, let's just say, people wanted to develop all of the property all at the same time, and we needed to have like an equal amount to mitigate, do those numbers equal out?
You know, I think it would be a challenge. I think that would definitely be a challenge. One of the problems the challenge we had when we were trying to identify sites for us, right, for the impacts we had on Mineral Creek, is there's not, as you guys know, there's not a lot of private property in San Juan County, right? So finding a property owner that wants wetlands on their property is somewhat rare, right? I mean, there's the whole thing about selling swampland. A lot of times people don't want wetlands on their property because they think that it will reduce the value of their property. But however, I would say that there are more and more landowners, like the Merrills, that recognize that, the conservation value of wetlands. And if they are looking for a site or for property, not for future, residential or commercial development, then those landowners may view wetlands positively. However, I think that, I mean, I would have to look at I don't think I can answer the question exactly. I'd have to look at, do a lot more research into figuring out, how much wetlands are on private property in Silverton, and compare that to, properties that had potential for wetland mitigation. But I would guess that you're not going to find enough in the private property in Silverton. That's not to say you can't do it on federal property, right? There's a couple mitigation projects. One is called the Chattanooga Fen Project, another is called the Ophir Fen Project. Those were mitigation projects for purgatory, that were, partnerships with the Forest Service. So there's possibilities to do things on federal land as well. It just adds another variable, right? You have to have a willing landowner, or, it has to kind of fit into their forest plan. And a lot of times, and then it could federalize the, mitigation process, right? Right now, if it's a private parcel, especially for, let's say we're just talking about non-jurisdictional wetlands in the town of Silverton, where there's no federal dollars involved whatsoever, it's just a private development and potentially mitigating with private development to create wetlands. You guys really wouldn't be subject to NEPA in that case. However, if you have a federal partner or there's federal dollars at that point, NEPA is going to come into play, and there's going to be a lot of other costs. They'll have to do historic and archaeological and threatened endangered species and surveys like that, just to confirm that everything's in compliance with NEPA.
And just kind of to add on to what Tim said, he's been nailing it so far. Typically, the Forest Service wants, they want to mitigate for the bigger projects, bigger impacts on their property. They don't want to nickel and dime small little mitigation sites, for small landowners in town. That's why they took on like the Purgatory project, because it was acres upon acres of wetland impact, and therefore it was a large mitigation site. Because as Tim said, they do have to do the NEPA process for that mitigation site, which is a long, lengthy process, and it has to fit, like you said, their forest plan and things like that. Has to check a lot of boxes. So I don't think they're as willing to do that for a bunch of small impacts as they are for larger impact projects, where they can make kind of a bigger positive impact on the environment and on wetlands.
Any other questions from the trustees at this juncture?
I have some questions I don't know when the right time to ask them are. And I also don't know that they can be answered.
Okay,
Um,
oh yeah, let's shoot. See if we're gonna address them later or, at this point, we're just presenting the information that's in your packet, basically, so.
Drop the question, but if later is better, that's okay too.
Okay.
So zooming out, we're trying to figure out what our policies around protecting wetlands should be in the town of Silverton. And to decide whether or not we want to attempt to create protections for non-jurisdictional wetlands, we have to determine whether, as it applies to Silverton, the protections for jurisdictional wetlands are insufficient or sufficient. And then there's a bunch of kind of related factors, like even if within the town of Silverton, the regulations for protecting jurisdictional wetlands are insufficient, we have the policy factors of to what extent do we want to overly protect the environment within our 0.8 square miles? Because there's, you know, if we came up with, you know, aggressive protections for non-jurisdictional wetlands, then we would have less developable land within the town, which would then kind of start to create some conflict with some of our other policy goals, like having an affordable housing market. So I feel like there's like a bunch of A/B questions that don't necessarily get us to a clear answer. Because if like A, we say, hey, we'd like to be more protective than the federal government is with respect to jurisdictional wetlands, but we also want to find a balance where we don't overly constrict development in Silverton. We have this like weird middle ground. And they both could kind of like trump each other to some extent. So my question even more generally is, how do you guys evaluate the extent to which the jurisdictional wetland protections seem sufficient if we wanted to take a pro-environmental protection position? Like, are there ways that you think the federal rules are maybe not sufficient for Colorado because as you said, jurisdictional only relates to things that can directly be tied to water flow into those two bodies of water, navigable waters. So like are in Colorado in general, do you think it would be better to have a more protective stance if we were pro? I'm trying not to like give you an unanswerable question, but like if we were pro, like to take a very pro-environmental approach, like do we need to do something more than rely on the federal
I
jurisdictional?
guess here's where, I mean, Tucker's could be in a tough spot there because he is the regulator of those. And I think he does a great job with regulating jurisdictional waters in you know, the local core office, I feel like does do a great job of ensuring that jurisdictional waters are protected. One thing that you guys could do to make sure things don't slip through the cracks there is I know in, let's say the town of, I work with so many local agencies, I might not be getting this 100% right, and this is going out on YouTube. So, but anyway, one of the towns we work with, so maybe I shouldn't say which one if I can't remember, but I believe in their planning process, they actually require, that's a checkbox like as part of their planning process, right? Is does the site include jurisdictional wetlands, yes or no? And then that puts the onus on the applicant to find out. And so they don't have projects that slip through the cracks where, you know, because in your guys' role as trustees and the planners, you guys don't have a, you know, a 404 wetland specialist on staff that's going to know every time if there's wetlands on someone's property or not. So that would be one way to ensure that the federal protections don't slip through the cracks, is just to have that as a checkbox with your development, in that they are looking for that. That's a resource that they're looking for. And if there is regulated wetlands, then obviously that goes to Tucker's office. And I think you can probably be pretty sure that things are going to be pretty well regulated from there. I think the risk, big picture with jurisdictional wetlands, is obviously what we've been talking about with the rule changes, right? And I don't know that it affects Silverton as much, right? So when that rule that Tucker was referencing, the navigable waters protection rule, when that was in place, every ephemeral wash lost its protections, right? An ephemeral wash is a body of water that only flows after it rains. You see those much more in the drier or more arid parts of our state, right? I mean, if you think of the Four Corners area, you have these huge watersheds, 20, 30-mile watersheds, but the creeks don't only flow when it rains, right? Because there's just not enough precipitation. There in Silverton, that's not as much of an issue. So I don't think that, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I can't really think of a scenario where jurisdictional status would have changed as much there as it has in other places. I know there were a lot of and I know the state of Colorado itself was opposed to the navigable waters protection rule because they thought it was insufficient at protecting water quality when all of those resources that were jurisdictional became non-jurisdictional. And there was a consideration that the state would then step in and create its own dredge fill program to kind of fill in that gap of waters that were previously jurisdictional, had always been jurisdictional, and all of a sudden under the navigable waters protection rule were not. That would be the only, I think, scenario in which you might want to look at something above and beyond what's currently regulated by the Corps. And that's something you could probably, I don't know that it's urgent to do it now, because right now the rules, all of those waters are back in jurisdictional again. Those ones that were taken out of jurisdiction of the navigable protection rule. So I think if you guys are following the back and forth of those, and if something like that ever happens again, at that point, the town might want to look at and say, is the current federal regulation enough to ensure water quality in our town? Yes or no? I can just tell you from the state of Colorado standpoint, I think now that the navigable waters protection rule is gone, the state of Colorado's opinion is that, yes, the current federal rules are enough on their own, and that their Corps' mitigation process is robust enough that we can defer to them. Non-jurisdictional is totally different, right? There's counties and cities that regulate them very closely. There's towns and cities and counties that basically allow anything goes. So that's up to the town on, and I completely understand your dilemma with land space and housing, and it's just I don't feel qualified. As someone who doesn't live in Silverton, I don't know that I feel qualified to answer that versus what the priority is there. But I could see that there could be conflicts for sure between development and wetland regulation if you include all the non-jurisdictional stuff.
That was super helpful. Thank you. And I do have one quick follow-up based on something you said. You mentioned how kind of like the purpose, at least in that explanation, of protecting wetlands is to protect water quality. That's kind of like the end goal. When looking at this, like, how does one balance the other potential goals? So water quality is very, very high priority in terms of wetland protection. What about wildlife habitat protection and other things like that? Because we've definitely discussed, if there's something that doesn't have water quality impact, but there are other pros to protecting it, does that those factors weigh in as highly?
They absolutely could, right? That gets back to the functions the various functions I was talking about that wetlands serve. And my background is mostly in water quality, so that maybe tends to be how I look at it. But absolutely, wetlands can provide, fish, wildlife habitat, Obviously moose have become pretty popular in the Silverton area. Wetlands are great habitat for moose. I think it's up to, I can't say what's more that one's more important than the other, but yeah, that's certainly a consideration also is wildlife, water quality. Those are probably the two big ones. In larger watershed areas, flood storage can be another consideration. But yeah, looking at all the various functions that the wetlands serve, and a lot of times the non-jurisdictional wetlands can also provide the same functions, right? If they're isolated or not, they can still be a place where pollutants drain to, get trapped into. The vegetation can over time, uptake those pollutants. They can provide great habitat, whether they're jurisdictional or not.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our trustees? Great. Dan, I saw you jump on or put on your video so you get bumped to the top. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna, is the typical direction of things to move from jurisdictional to non-jurisdictional and not the other way from non-jurisdictional to jurisdictional?
Are you
I'll let
talking
you
about
tell.
like based on what our current rulings or current definitions of waters of the US are, like kind of projecting how those are trending?
Yeah, and I guess historically too, like in the past, have things gone from jurisdictional to non-jurisdictional in a more typical fashion rather than the flip side, going from non-jurisdictional and returning to jurisdictional?
It's hard to predict with
I
the
would say
future
seems
will
so,
hold, but in the past, things have been relatively stable, believe it or not, since 1986 till 2015. The definition of waters of the U.S. was relatively stable. There were a couple court cases here and there that changed how we came to those determinations, such as the 08 Rapanos ruling and things like that. But these kind of overarching and sweeping rule changes, those are kind of a new thing, starting kind of in 2015 with the Obama administration. They wanted a new rule that kind of had more protection. The following administration came in and wanted to kind of dial it back. They saw it as an overreach. The current administration wants to, kind of bring some of those protections back. And so I think it is kind of going to be this sort of ebb and flow, depending on who's in office and what their kind of opinion is on waters of the United States, and what level of protection they want to give them. So it does kind of ebb and flow. I could tell you this new rule coming out next month will kind of be more along the lines of what we currently have in place. So it's relatively stable. However, it will be subject to litigation. It's there's lots of groups across the country talking about suing the federal government again, and issuing a stay. But I believe if they issued a stay on this most current rule that's about to come out, we would just go back to what we're doing right now, which is pretty similarly aligned with the new rule. So for the time being, it'll kind of be status quo. But who knows with the next administration, which direction they want to go. Yeah, kind of tumultuous times in regards to waters of the U.S. definition.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I don't think you could really say it's permanently trending one direction or the other. I think it's, like I said, for that wetlands protection executive order was actually issued by the first Bush administration, and as Tucker said, wetland regulation was pretty stable, and wetlands were not a political topic. That all changed. But I forget the name of the Obama rule because they all clean water rule. Is that what it was called, Tucker? Anyway,
Yeah, clean water
at
rule.
that point, as soon as that was issued, it became challenged by every Republican AG. And then when the Trump rule came out, it was challenged by every Democratic AG. And what you're going to see moving forward, I think, is every time there's a change in party in the executive branch, you're going to see either a strengthening or dialing back of of wetlands protections. And I don't, without being able to predict how that's going to go, I don't think we can predict if they're going to become more protective or less protective moving forward.
One thing it could potentially add on to that is, when the navigable water protection rule was around, Tim alluded to this earlier, the state of Colorado was talking about implementing their own Clean Water Act program, wetland protection program. We in the Corps kind of called it the gap waters rule, where they were implying that they wanted to regulate waters that fell out of the Corps' jurisdiction. So if we were to see a long-term dialing back of federal protection, there is a chance the state could step in and assume some of that role. They've talked about it in the past. So if the state thinks it's important, they may go that route for as far as long-term protection to kind of cover some of those waters if we do get an administration that dials us back quite a bit.
Thank you.
Oh, you got it. Awesome. I'll put out the call one more time, and then since it's about almost 6 o'clock, I wanted to dive into a couple of the wetland policy concepts and kind of walk those through with you all if you all have time. And if Tucker and Tim, if you guys have time to stay on, I know we had kind of promised an hour. It would be great, but if not, we totally understand.
I'm good. I could stay on till as long as you need me.
Well, careful with that one.
All right, hard stop at 7 then.
Sally?
I wonder, this is such a great transition, and I think we're ready for it. And my question sort of relates to that second part. So as we sort of look through how this might look in Silverton, I wondered if there's any information that other communities have learned through their various approaches of like more stringent to less stringent municipal policies and ordinances and such relating to wetlands that they have later reflected on as either this has been really successful, or it turns out this really kind of did the opposite of what we were thinking, or if of just like backstory behind the scenes lessons. I'm kind of curious about those.
The only ones I can say, and I guess I don't want to bring up any specific towns, but like I said, I know some localities have been burned in their planning process by all of a sudden somebody finds out, they approve a plan. Let's say they approve a plan for residential development, and then it's later discovered that that's going to impact wetlands, right? And then it kills the project, and it spent a lot of effort went into the planning on the local side. So I know that's why that one locality added that as kind of a check mark to their planning process, and I think it's been largely a success. The other backstory, I guess, and this is public knowledge, is the Telluride ski area is one of the largest 404 violations in the history of our country. So to make sure that that never happens again, and I don't think it was anything that was done intentionally. I think it was this when these regulations were new. People weren't aware that the wetlands were there, that they were protected, that they had to be mitigated, right? And all this stuff got built. And I think, San Miguel County, Mountain Village, town of Telluride, they don't ever want to get in that scenario again. So that might be why I can't speak for them exactly, but 404 permitting is also different in I believe it has anything to do with the Mountain Village area as a result of that, right? It's all done under a consent order as opposed to a standard 404 permit. It's a consent order under that violation. So they have stricter requirements from the feds because of that consent order than probably other towns and cities have in our area. So that might be why they have, and it could just be that they want to be good stewards. I don't know, but that I will say that they have stricter federal requirements. And they want to be absolutely sure that they don't miss any wetlands. So that might be why they have stricter local requirements with regards to wetlands. And Tucker, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that consent order stuff.
Nope, that all jives with my recollection of what went
Yeah.
on there well before my time, but that
Yeah,
checks
but I
out.
mean, before I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I think that violation was before I started doing the work. So it was a long time ago. But it has changed the way that they do federal 404 permitting in that area.
And Dana, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick question while we have Tucker and Tim on the line. Because you just mentioned the permitting process, Tim. If Tucker, you could clarify for just the public record and for all of us on this meeting that just because something is jurisdictional doesn't necessarily automatically preclude something from happening on it either. So maybe for those of us who've never been through the permitting process for jurisdictional wetlands, if you could just clarify for us briefly, like what can be even done on a jurisdictional wetland. And then again, I know we're talking about moving into policies and ideas for potentially non-jurisdictional wetlands.
Sure, yeah. So we kind of treat them all on a case-by-case basis. And so if we determine a wetland is in fact jurisdictional, and the applicant, builder, whoever, property owner, wants to develop the property, and their plans involve the discharge of fill material into waters of the US, they would need to apply for a permit through us. And we have, depending on the severity of the impacts, different types of permits. We have, kind of the low-hanging fruit are nationwide permits. Those are going to be your kind of more minimal impact projects, more common with what you'd see with like a single family development. And then we have regional general permits, which are specific to projects that we see in Colorado that occur frequently enough that maybe we don't have a nationwide permit for. So they're activity based on a need that the Corps has identified within the state. So an example of that is we have a stream stabilization regional permit. We also have a stream stabilization nationwide permit. However, our regional permit has, we can permit larger impacts under that permit, just based on, we have, Colorado has high gradient streams that can do a lot of damage and then move around a lot. So they may, someone could propose a larger project that we could determine maybe doesn't have an adverse impact, but it doesn't quite fit the nationwide permit. So we created our own permit to try and streamline that process. And then we have standard permits or individual permits. Those are going to be your bigger developments that impact greater than a half an acre of waters of the US. And so anything under a half an acre could potentially qualify for a nationwide permit or a regional general permit. Anytime you get over that half acre threshold, that's an individual permit, which is a much more strenuous process. We look at alternatives analysis, which is basically, why can't you build this development here instead, where there's no wetlands or there's less wetlands, things like that. And so in most cases, I'd venture out to say 98% of our permits are probably nationwide permits. And so in order to get one of those, the property owner or whoever wants to develop the property would submit what's known as a pre-construction notification. This is essentially an application, basically telling us, what are you going to do? What's the purpose of the project? What's the need for this project? And then it requires that you quantify those impacts to waters of the US, either square feet or acreage, and quantify the amount of fill material going into those waters. And so based on that, the information you provide, a lot of times folks will hire a wetland consultant or environmental consultant to help them do some of that legwork because it can be lengthy. It requires a delineation of the wetlands. And then, we build plans kind of overlaid on top of that to help quantify those. And so when we receive all that information, we screen it against one of our 59 or however many nationwide permits we have now to see if it meets the criteria for one of those permits. And so some of those permits are bank stabilization, residential development, commercial development, discharges and ditches, boat ramps. There's like I said, there's about 59 different ones, and they're all activity based. So we would be, and they, based on the activity, some have different thresholds versus others for what we allow as far as wetland impacts. And so I guess on that note, seems like residential or commercial development are kind of the main hot ticket items in the Silverton area. If someone wanted to develop, say, a single family residential home on a jurisdictional wetland, they would submit that pre-construction notification along with a delineation and all those items I mentioned, quantifying your impacts, things like that. They would submit that to us. We would screen it against Nationwide Permit 29 for residential developments. And if it's over 1/10 of an acre, we would require compensatory mitigation at least a 1-to-1 ratio. And if it was determined that the project would result in impacts to over 1/2 an acre, we would tell them their project does not qualify for a nationwide permit. They'd have to go through the individual permit route. Like I said, it's much lengthier process, much more involved, involves a public notice period where the public and other federal agencies like the EPA and Colorado Parks and Wildlife and CDPH&E would have a chance to comment on the project and basically point out flaws, basically why it shouldn't occur or things they could do better to eliminate or avoid and minimize some of their impacts. Sorry, I know you asked for a concise, brief description, but nothing in our program's all that brief, unfortunately.
That's super helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Sure.
So just to clarify, like if we're talking about residential, we're talking about a lot of it is based off of acreage and size of impact.
Correct. Yeah. And the 1/2 an acre is the real kicking point for us. Under 1/2 an acre, we would look at a nationwide permit, which can be a much easier process than an individual permit. But like anything over 1/10 of an acre will require mitigation. Under 1/10 of an acre typically does not require mitigation if they can keep their impacts that small. However, that's a kind of a case-by-case determination as well. We can require mitigation on those projects. However, it's rare that we do. We have to have really good justification for requiring mitigation on those really small projects.
And when you're talking about acreage, you're talking about acreage of impact, not necessarily acreage of a lot. Someone could have 5 acres, but only be impacting less than 1/2 an acre of wetland area. And that's where you'd be talking about that 1/2 an acre, 1/10 of an acre, over 1/2 an acre. Okay. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. That only applies to waters of the US. So wetlands, streams, lakes, ponds, springs, things like that.
Great. Thank you. All right, so we are going to dive into these wetland policy concepts. And I do want to preface that, we're not experts on each of these policies yet. We just wanted to kind of get you guys in front of these policies, gauge how you are feeling about these policies, and then we can definitely do deep dives and do some research, call these different municipalities that we pulled these from and get more information. So the first one that we have here is an area of concerns map. And I want to say this is all outlined in your packet, and you did a great job putting that together. So this is just kind of an outline if you want more details on each one. We do lay out purpose, example, implications, Silverton implications specifically, and then options for those policies that we've seen. So the first one of those policies is the area of concerns map. And I would preface this that the USGS has some generalized data maps on hydric soil, but they're not specific to Silverton. Like you can look up a map on USGS, but they're not going to be specific. Like you would really need like a site visit. You would need someone to come out when the snow's melted. And John's looked into this, and you would have someone do a drone kind of over and then on the ground as well assessment to really be able to determine that. So I can pass this off too, because I haven't been doing the research Lucy had and John had. So if there's anything I'm missing from here, please let me know and we can address it. But any questions, or how are you guys feeling about a possible area of concerns map? Is that something like, do you have any questions on it that we need to follow up on?
I feel like we need to make some of the other decisions before directing staff to
Yeah,
prioritize something like that. This is just my opinion, not the board's opinion, obviously, but I think the higher level discussion of whether or not, after all the information we've gathered, we think it's important to develop additional policy around wetlands besides relying on jurisdictional wetland policy. That would kind of be the first question for the board to consider. And then if the board did want to pursue additional regulation, then I think this probably would be the first question to ask after that. Is that fair, board members?
you want to take a step back and kind of have a discussion about jurisdictional, non-jurisdictional, or do you guys need some time to digest that and we just present the information?
I think why don't you go ahead and present all the information, and then if there's discussion tonight, great. If maybe that's better for like an actual meeting where we could provide like
Direction.
vision about it and give direction.
Yeah,
But I think like directing you guys tonight or having the board provide a suggestion to do more work on this should follow the decision of whether or not we want to create more rules or not.
fair. And hopefully seeing these policy concepts can give you all tools to help make that decision on jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional. I
mean, that sounds good to me, but I'm one of 7, so I'd love to just confirm either, everyone else thinking similarly or hear objections so that we could, tell everybody what's best for the board.
Yeah, it's hard for me to have any questions specific to this approach without knowing more about all the different options or approach personally.
Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, I'm in agreement with Shane. I think there's a lot to be determined before we move forward with direction, and this has been very insightful. Taking lots of notes.
Yeah, is there a staff need for a certain approach here, or does that work for staff if we just
the goal was to just get you guys as much information about wetland policies, jurisdictional, non-jurisdictional, so that you guys can make an informed decision at some point.
Awesome.
So we're happy to run through these and kind of give an outline of each one, and then you can we'll get feedback at a meeting where you guys can give us direction. Does that work?
Yep, sounds great.
Super. Okay, so I think this one came from Mount Crested Butte on our screen here. And other areas of concern maps can come from Ophir as well, so just right over the hill. But just trying to think about other areas that or potentially this could be in-house with staff looking at it, or it would be something that we would publish and people could make the determination there. There are some implications on what this might do to property values, what this might do to development in general. Like all of these concepts, these policy concepts honestly have implications for property values and what it would do for development. Anything to add, Liz, on this one?
Yeah, so this would kind of operate similar to our hazard overlay zone maps. So when we have an inquiry for a building permit or a planning permit or a planning process, we'd kind of look at these maps and that would trigger a wetland development review process if we wanted to adopt one. And so we would kind of, if we were to get an areas of concerns map, we would use that in order to trigger the determination, the requirement for determination. And if that were to come back with evidence of wetlands, then we would get a delineation from the US Army Corps of Engineers. So that's kind of how the map would operate. And that puts the burden more on the town to kind of map out those areas. And as well as legal liability, as Gloria noted.
I'm just gonna have you walk through these.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Oh, Dana.
Can I clarify really quick, since you mentioned this, Lucy, made me think of it. Besides kind of what's been triggered with our watershed language in the code, as part of our building process, we don't currently have anything like Tim was talking about, where there's like a, hey, have we checked to see if this is even jurisdictional wetlands, correct? So I know we're talking about non-jurisdictional wetlands today. We're pretty clear on jurisdictional wetlands, but do we have anything in our process where staff ask the applicant to verify or provide that, whether it's jurisdictional or not?
Yeah, that's a great point. So let me back up a little bit. The town doesn't currently have super clear regulations in place to require determination or delineation prior to development, other than the watershed protection code. And our watershed protection district is mostly outside of town. So these next three policy options are options that would trigger the determination. So yes, that's correct. That's what these policies would do. And we don't currently have clear policies to do so.
You know, the next one?
Yeah, let's go to the next one. Okay, so next one is, as Tim noted, about the town that requires all building permits to get a determination before building. That's kind of what this option is. So you'd be basically required, if you were to build anything new, to get a determination or delineation before receiving your building permit. So this would take the burden off the town, but put it onto the applicant. But this would create a standardized process that could potentially show ecological assets that we would have missed if it weren't a process in our codes. So we talked to one of our engineers, and we learned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think a determination costs anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000. Does that sound right to Tim and Tucker?
Probably there's two separate things there, right? So one is the delineation and the other is the determination.
Right.
A lot of time, I would say 90% of the time, the determination is probably not needed because it's typically cheaper for everybody involved to just assume that it's jurisdictional and then permit it through the process that Tucker was describing than it is to go down the process so to get a permit a lot of times is a cheaper and faster process than it is to get the determination that something's not jurisdictional.
Okay.
So I think the price would be, that sounds right for like $1,500 to $2,000. That sounds right for like one lot, right? I mean, obviously if we're talking about a much bigger area, the price goes up and forgive me, I mean, who knows, with inflation, it's hard to commit. That's what it cost back when I used to charge people to do that before I worked for CDOT. That would have been probably the right cost I would have charged, but that was also 5-6 years ago, and everything costs a lot more these days than it used to. So, but yeah, I would just want to I think it becomes pretty onus on the applicant And then probably overly onus on Tucker's office if they're asking for a determination on every time. But if it's just to find out the delineated boundaries, I think that's what you're showing here with Larimer County. And then that's also what the towns and that I've worked with in our region have something very similar, right? Where they're just asking for the wetland boundaries. And then, at that point, then there can be discussions as to whether or not it's worth a permit or if it's worth trying to pursue non-jurisdictional, and that's kind of up to the applicant. But at least there's no surprises as to whether there's wetlands or not.
And it sounds like in that instance, what you're talking about, Tim, is the determination between jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional, not necessarily the determination of, is this area a wetland geologically or hydrologically?
And I think what is in this Larimer County code here is whether or not it's a wetland, yes or no, not whether or not it's jurisdictional, yes or no. That's the part that can be pretty costly to determine, and is I would say costs more than $1,500 to $2,000. But just finding out if wetlands are present, yes or no, and getting the data, that could be overlaid on a site plan. That's usually what the towns I've worked with require. They don't require actual jurisdictional determination if it's jurisdictional or not at that planning stage.
That's been my experience too, Tim. Most townships or counties, local governments, they just want to know, are there wetlands, yes or no?
Right.
And then the onus is on the applicant to figure out, if they're jurisdictional or not, if they want to pursue that route via jurisdictional determination, or just assume, if there are wetlands present, just assume they're jurisdictional, get the permit anyways. That's most oftentimes what we see. We don't need to do a full-blown jurisdictional determination to issue a permit. Sometimes it's easier just to get the permit, especially if it's for small minimal impacts under 1/10 of an acre or something like that. A lot of times it is quicker just to get the permit from the Corps. And we do, they're kind of in line with jurisdictional determinations, but we do aquatic resource boundary confirmations, which would be where a consultant has gone out, delineated a property, verified the absence or presence of wetlands, and we would write back, or we would review that and write back, saying whether we concur or don't agree with their delineation. And so that would be a great starting point to then facilitate, whether the permitting route needs to be gone down or if a jurisdictional determination is needed.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I guess to clarify, this option would be to show if there's wetlands on the property or not, and then to go the step further and get the determination and the delineation. So as I noted, that takes the burden off of the town to get to do a wetlands map or to do other work, but that would put the burden onto the applicant. Any questions about this policy option?
What would trigger the need to do this? Just any building application or just a building application that's like not in the middle of town where there's.
And potentially it could be paired with an areas map as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so our options, I guess, would be to require a determination, not non-jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional, but wetlands or no wetlands for all planning and building permits. Or this could be a staff triggered requirement based on staff's knowledge of the area.
I'm just, the reason I ask is like, imagine, one of the infill lots on Green Street that has buildings on both sides and have to behind it. Like, is that still going to be something where, the town says arbitrarily, here's a building application, so spend $1,500 to get a delineation, even though someone's gonna be able to look right at it on a like Google Maps in 2 seconds, be like, nope. So I was just, and then the second part of that would be, if we did something like this, is there like a minimum footprint that potential wetlands would need to take up to trigger this? So like if you have, one willow on a parcel of land that otherwise doesn't have any visible evidence of wetland at all, like is that going to trigger it, or is there got to be like a minimum 0.0 something acreage?
Right.
And those are all great questions.
Yeah.
As we can dive into this.
Yeah.
We're not gonna have all the answers.
Yeah.
tonight, But, keep asking these questions and we're writing them down and kind of we'll work through them.
Yeah. And
If
also,
we're given that direction.
Cool.
yeah. And also I'm trying to include every option. So some of them might sound
Totally.
crazy. But yeah. Dana?
Yeah, can I just clarify? I'm still stuck on something that both Tim and Tucker said, just to make sure I understand, because I recognize that other municipalities do different things. Let me think of how to phrase my question. What I think I heard you say, Tim, is that sometimes the determination is not a worthwhile step going through because it would be too costly. And so an applicant may just if they think they have soggy soil on their land, they may choose to just go through the permitting process with the Army Corps and see if then the Army Corps decides this is a wetland that needs to be delineated. Like, could you just clarify that for a second?
Yeah,
Do some
I think the
applicants
key-
actually go through the determination process?
Sure.
Again, wetland or not, or Army Corps jurisdictional or
Right.
not?
I think the distinction is the two words delineation and determination, and they do not mean the same thing. The delineation would quantify the area of property that is wetland, or is not wetland. The determination would be to determine if it's jurisdictional or not. And that's the step that applicants often choose to not do, that they will hire someone to do the delineation, or as Tucker indicated I'm not trying to add more work to Tucker, but on a lot of small, like if it's a single family residence or something like that, I know of cases where they were able to get the Corps to come do the delineation for them. And then, like I said, the determination is the second step. So if delineation has been done and it has been discovered through the delineation, I'm trying not to conflate the terms myself, that there are wetlands, then a lot of times the applicant will just concede that they are jurisdictional. A lot of times it may not affect any, right? If they're not actually going to build on let's say, build on the wetlands, then that's over. It doesn't matter if there's wetlands there, but at least they're aware that they're there and then they don't build on them. If they do have to build on them, a lot of times it's easier to get a permit, as Tucker laid out, than it is to actually get that determination, because it can be pretty tricky figuring out if a wetland is truly isolated or not, or if it's jurisdictional or not. And that can be a rabbit hole that a applicant could potentially spend thousands of dollars and then not get obviously if they're doing that, they're trying to prove that it's not jurisdictional, and they don't always get the answer they want. So sometimes it's easier to just get the permit up front because you know what you're dealing with. Hopefully that answered the question. And then I guess the other thing I will say is my experience with other localities is, especially on lots that are already paved and things such as that, where there's obviously no wetlands. I think a lot of times the potential applicant can just check the box, no wetlands. And the staff at that municipality can say, yeah, I agree with that based on how obvious it is that there's no wetlands. So I think those municipalities that have that checkbox, like as I was describing, don't necessarily require every single applicant to come to hire a consultant to visit every single parcel that's going to get developed. Their staff has the leeway to say, yeah, this one has some areas that are questionable or not. And the first, I guess usually they put the checklist to the applicant to say wetlands, yes or no. And then a lot of times the applicant will realize at that point they have to get some help with that answer. But if it's just an obvious no, that there's no wetlands, then that's usually the end of it.
Yeah, that's helpful. But again, just terms matter. And so I think as we're having this discussion,
Yep.
we're thinking about potential determination. Is this wetlands? Yes or no? Not, is it even jurisdictional wetlands? Just, is it wetlands? Yes or no? And so that's where this determination term gets a little bit fuzzy because it
Well, right,
means
and that's-
something within the Army Corps practice, but we're talking
Right.
about it a little bit differently. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
that's why, as it relates to wetlands, I wouldn't recommend using the term determination at all, unless you're referring to whether it's jurisdictional, yes or no. If it's just wetland, yes or no, I would use delineation as the term you're using.
That's helpful. Thank
In the Corps vocabulary, we use determination is the yes or no if it's jurisdictional or not. The delineation is just kind of identifying the boundaries of any resources that may or may not be on the site. And then a verification is kind of the term we use for yes or no. We're verifying yes, there's wetlands, or verifying no, there are not. So maybe aquatic resource verification might be a kind of a cleaner term to use.
Thanks. That's helpful.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up. I think I was using those words wrong, so that's helpful. So then our next policy option to trigger a verification and so forth is a wetland functional analysis data form. So this example comes from Crested Butte. And it's a form that staff can fill out when deciding if a wetland verification would be required. This can include a checklist of local ecological assets that the town would like to protect beyond the characteristics of a jurisdictional wetland. And by developing a checklist that the staff can fill out, we're limiting the burden of requiring kind of this step on the applicant, especially if there are no signs of wetlands. And this would include a site-specific analysis, a more site-specific analysis than an area of concerns map, or could be used in conjunction with an area of concerns map. And so this would require staff to have an understanding of our local ecological assets and environmental sensitive areas. Staff training would be required and an upfront cost and consultant work would be required to develop this checklist, as well as a guide and to conduct staff training. So there would be an initial cost, but following that, the cost of the town would be minimal other than staff time to conduct staff visits. Any questions on this or comments from Tim, Tucker, or John and Katie?
Would the staff need to be certified in this, or is it something that as we developed our own program, like if someone were to move on and someone else would fill the role who hadn't been through the training, would they also need to go through the training or?
Yeah, I think there would need to be some type of a training as well as a guide to be able to fill this out, that we would have hopefully a consultant do. And I'm interested in reaching out to Crested Butte to find out more about how they did it, if we were interested in going with this route. And this would probably fall under Public Works Director. Okay. So these next few policies are examples of regulations over wetlands in Colorado that are more stringent than federal regulations in Colorado, as in adopted by local municipalities. So kind of the most basic is wetland disturbance is prohibited. So the purpose of this is to protect environmentally sensitive areas, including jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional wetlands, by prohibiting development on such areas. This may include buffer zones or compensatory mitigation when development cannot be avoided or when the town grants an exception. So this example is from Telluride. The implications for Silverton is that this would stop development on all wetlands and potentially environmentally sensitive areas. This would protect the remaining local wetlands, preserving biodiversity and ecosystem services. However, many of these areas that would be protected under a regulation like this are platted and privately owned or in the town of Silverton's public right of way. And many of our environmentally sensitive areas are in residential districts. And so this could potentially have legal implications and would limit development of housing. Additionally, not all wetlands are created equal, so some may be less valuable to our local ecology than others. And so an option would be for the town to work with consultants to determine the extent to which these areas should be protected. Yeah, this is kind of a basic one, but a very stringent one.
Okay.
Okay. So the next are buffer zones and setbacks. Wetland buffers are areas that surround wetlands that reduce adverse impacts on wetland functions, values from adjacent development. The literature indicates that buffers reduce wetland impacts by moderating the effects of stormwater runoff, including stabilizing soils to prevent erosion, filtering suspended solids, nutrients, and harmful toxic substances. Buffers provide essential habitat for wetland associated species and reduce adverse impact of human disturbance on wetland habitats. So a lot of municipalities that have any type of wetland regulations will have buffer zone and setback regulations, and they will vary depending on the characteristics of wetlands. Some are really straightforward, crested butte. They range from 25 to 100 feet. Some areas are as low as 5 feet, but I don't know how helpful that is. Silverton's implications is that our lots are usually pretty small, so a buffer zone of even 25 feet could be the size of a lot and could significantly impede development. However, this measure would protect and preserve local wetlands and environmentally sensitive areas, preserving biodiversity and ecological assets. So options for this are we could adopt a standard buffered zone. We could adopt a buffer table similar to Fort Collins has a buffer zone table that lists their zones dependent on characteristics. Or we could work with a consultant to develop site-specific buffer zone dependent on the specific characteristics of that wetland area.
If this becomes an approach that we discuss in earnest, I'd be curious to know if this is applied equally to private property and municipal property, or if there are different rules for municipal property,
Okay,
public rights of way and things like that.
thanks.
You.
Real quick, just some background here. So, CDOT is often a regulated entity doing development. So we are subject to these buffer zone setbacks in the places that have them. And although it seems like it's probably easiest to adopt a blanket one, a lot of times the topography doesn't necessarily make sense for some of the buffer zones I've seen on some wetlands. For example, like we've had some where there's 100-foot buffer, and that 100-foot buffer goes all the way up one hill and down the other hill. And obviously there's nothing on the other side of the hill that would affect the wetland if it's on the other side of a hill, right? So as a regulated, I guess potentially regulated entity working in Silverton, that would just be something to maybe consider is a cap on the buffer based on the topography that makes sense, right? I don't know if I'm explaining that correctly, but if you pick a number up to that number and less, it's clear that the topography indicates that working in that buffer would not affect that wetland. Does that make sense? Have I explained that correctly in a way that translates? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so compensatory mitigation, we kind of spoke on this, so I won't go super into it. But some other strategies that other municipalities use, I think restoration is kind of considered the preferred approach, but is fee in lieu, remote preservation or creation are also options that other Colorado municipalities use. And I think if we were to adopt something like this in Silverton, we would want to identify a restoration project. And we could kind of work in policy so that that mitigation contributes to that project. But I also want to recognize, as Tim noted, that it's not always super beneficial to kind of develop on wetlands in one area and then do mitigation in another area, especially if they're going to have different functions. So kind of options for this would be to adopt a mitigation plan and regulations, including a project. We could use this to require mitigation rather than prohibiting development in wetland areas. We could create an agreement with the town and applicants in a case-by-case basis, or we could avoid it altogether.
Any questions on this one? Kind of covered this.
Yeah. And then I believe this is our final kind of policy. This would be to work with a consultant or a referral agent on a case-by-case basis and send applications to develop on wetlands to referral agencies who can better analyze the impacts of development on a site-by-site or a site-specific basis and can better recommend wetland mitigation requirements or can kind of give us a more site-specific kind of analysis of how to interact with that applicant and application. And that's something that Basalt does, and I think a few other communities that community planning strategies works with. Katie's mentioned this to me, but seems like a great option, especially if we don't want to kind of adopt a across the board policies that could put us in have legality implications.
Then again, this would be triggered by a map of some sort or a checklist or.
Yeah, so this would be if we were determined, if we were to know that there was wetlands in an area, and then we kind of got that delineation. And then we were trying to, the board was trying to decide kind of where to go from there, if they should be allowed to develop or if that wetland is a ecological asset for the town, and it should be avoided. But again, this strategy would put the burden, it would end up, the burden would be more on the applicant, as they would probably have to kind of pay for that referral agency's review.
Okay. So we've run through most of our policy options here. Tim and Tucker, did we leave any big ones out, do you think, or do you think we covered them? We're looking at big concepts, kind of.
Yeah, I can't really think of anything else that I've seen.
Yeah, as your question relates to other municipalities, yeah, no, I think what your staff has shown here is a pretty good rundown of what other folks are doing or not doing.
And John, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I just have a couple of notes before we finish up. I just wanted the trustees to be clear that staff embarked upon this effort because we obviously don't have much code on the books when it comes to wetlands. And we need some. And these are options for solutions. This is just kind of a running through some of the stuff that we've researched, and most of it's been focused on whether or not you want to protect non-jurisdictional wetlands. But we definitely need to have better policy in place for something that may be jurisdictional. And we ran into that problem at the campground where we had liability. And right now, staff doesn't have good code on the books for what if it might be? Do we have a checklist? Does the building inspector have that on his checklist? Is this a wetland? Right now, he doesn't. So we need that at the very least as we go through this process, whether or not you want to protect non-jurisdictional wetlands or not. But that is another key question that we're asking the trustees. Are non-jurisdictional wetlands something that you want to consider protecting? And that has come up with recent applications. And the final thing that I wanted to mention was Tucker talked about nationwide permits earlier, and this doesn't have to do with code policy, but the parcel of land down at the wastewater treatment facility, the reason that we are considering that as a potential permit for us at 0.49 or 48 acres is because it would fall under the nationwide permit and would be a lot easier to make happen logistically with the Corps. So those are just a few notes that I wanted to mention before we wrapped up and got into the final couple of slides. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And I threw up here, basically, if you go to our muni code and you search wetlands, you're only going to get this definition. And that's what we're working off of right now. So that's kind of that's why we researched all these policies to try and give some direction to staff on how to facilitate this in the future. Yep.
It may have been said before, but with what frequency does the existence of a jurisdictional wetland how frequently does the jurisdictional wetland map change? Is that something, is it kind of like a tattletale update, or is it something that's visited with some regularity?
I'll leave that to Tim or Tucker.
Yeah, I want to say either Jefferson County or Boulder tried to basically quantify every single wetland they had within their municipality, and it was just they were constantly updating and modifying and revising. Of course, that's a much bigger area than Silverton, but it was a moving target. It may not be, my experience is it's more of a moving target in areas that get a lot of irrigation. Right, obviously where we put water dictates what's wet and what's not. With Silverton not having a lot of irrigation or any that I'm aware of, it probably isn't going to change that much, other than the things Tucker was describing with regards to the regulations changing. I think it'd be difficult to keep a master map of every jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional wetland in the town at all times. I think that's a lot, and probably more work than is necessary, since it's really only areas of potential development where that's even a factor. Yeah, I don't know if that answered that question or not.
No, it sounds like you did. Thank you. It sounds like it's a moving target, and that, trying to even though it's only 0.8 square miles, it's not something that's easy to just be like, the areas of concern map could kind of highlight all areas of concern relatively easily, but identifying jurisdictional wetlands and then saying this is it for the next 5 years, we'll revisit this in 2028 doesn't sound feasible.
Right. I think that's correct.
Yeah, you answered my question very well. Thank you.
And then I'll leave us with what our Silverton Compass Master Plan says in it. So these are the references you could find, and you can go to these pages to get the full information for each of these. But just kind of wanted to let you all know that it's not mentioned specifically in an action item, but it is mentioned throughout the master plan. So that's where we're at. Any other questions?
Dana has her hand up.
Dana?
Yeah, I think before we lose Tim and Tucker, I think I'd really love to hear you guys, since you see so many other municipalities and so many other implications and unintended consequences. you've seen what other places do. We can articulate that we have a variety of priorities from our recent master plan, which include affordable housing and making development easier so that more people can build and develop in town. So we have these kind of different priorities. And I guess I'm just curious if we've heard these variety of policy options. Are there blind spots that you think municipalities have succumb to, or when balancing these variety of priorities, right? Like not undue burden on the town and staff, not undue burden on the applicant, making the development we want to see happen easier while also having responsible land use growth and development and stewarding our environment. You see these mountain communities facing these challenges. Are there blind spots we're not aware of? Are there unintended consequences in some of these policies that maybe we're not aware of when we just see them on the book? So I'd love to hear your expertise on that before we lose you, because I think a lot of this other stuff we can have staff and trustee conversation on, but I'd love to hear your input.
The only thing I can think of, and if you go back to that last slide on your definition of wetlands, if you guys are going to adopt some sort of specific in-town wetland protection, whether it be jurisdictional or not, I would make sure you define the wetlands as having hydric soils, wetland vegetation, and wetland hydrology. The way that one is currently written, you could, it's kind of difficult to say. For example, we know willows grow where there's water, right? Does that mean every single stem of willow is a wetland? Hopefully not, right? I don't think anybody intends that. So I think that's kind of the one unintended consequence I've seen that some of these municipalities have, is when they have an overly broad definition of wetlands. And therefore it could incorporate anything where, basically anything where willows grow. And they can grow places that don't have hydric soils and don't have wetland hydrology. So I would be careful with that. That's the one, I think, kind of unintended consequence. Other than that, I'm not comfortable weighing in on what the town's priorities are of wetlands versus housing. I mean, wow, that's why you guys are in the position you're in.
Yeah, I would agree with Tim. I would be careful on the definition. Like he said, you don't want to be regulating an area that only meets one of the three parameters. You're going to find yourself with a lot of areas, and B, the Corps won't be able to back you up because it needs to meet all three parameters of a wetland for us to even kind of have a seat at the table. So yeah, really keying in that definition to include the hydrology, the soil, and the vegetation, and needing to meet all three of those parameters, I think would be helpful. As far as other, undue consequences, the burden on the town could be greater if you were to implement something like this. But if that's something the town wants, then by all means, go for it. The Corps works with other towns and counties that have similar items, and we certainly want to help where we can. That's kind of our job. But I do see some other towns and counties running into the issue where they require say a 50-foot setback, and they want the Corps to concur on that, and it just creates more of a process. It's one more item for the applicant to do. But again, the Corps is willing to do that. We do that, all across the state. I'll leave it at that without going too far.
Yeah. And then like the other unintended consequence is what I brought up earlier with Tucker bringing up the setbacks, right? The buffer absolutely works to protect wetlands. However, sometimes the buffer if you just pick a blanket number, it might not really match up with the reality of an area that is actually could harm the wetland, right? Especially if you cross over and it's now all the water's draining the other direction and away from the wetland. And a lot of times they've dealt with, those towns and municipalities that have those buffer setbacks, they provide variances for that, so it can be dealt with administratively when that happens, and they say, okay, yeah, we can see that this isn't actually a threat to the wetland. You're free to develop here. However, it's extra work for their staff every time they have to grant one of those variances or development permits.
Thank you too. That's helpful to hear your feedback.
And that is the end of our presentation. I would love to thank Tucker and Tim for jumping on tonight and giving us their insight.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Tucker. Thank you, Tim. That's awesome.
Yeah. Glad to do it. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Really helpful, everyone. Good night.
I did have one comment for the trustees, but it looks like we already lost Sally before we adjourned. But I just wanted to kind of plant the seed that our goal is to represent the community, not to represent our personal opinions on this. And unless we have robust community engagement on each topic, there is a lot of subjectivity into how we view what the community wants us to do on policy decisions like this. But I just wanted to remind everybody to really think hard about what the whole community wants and not just what aligns with your viewpoint as we consider these policy considerations leading into the next meeting. And so I just wanted to plant that seed before we say goodnight to think about for the next week. That's all. It sounds like we're all good for tonight. Thank you, everybody. Meeting adjourned. It's 6:52 p.m. This was awesome. Really appreciate everyone's participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Lucy.
thank you for having me. If you have any
Together.
questions, please
Yeah.
feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Tucker. Here.
Good evening, everyone.
Thanks, staff.